After 29 COPs, there is so little to show on the climate change front. 29 attempts to get tens of thousands of people to fly all over the world for a regular circus. And yet, if we look at the outcomes, since 1990, 2 parts per million carbon added to the concentration in the atmosphere, year after year after year. That means that temperatures have been going up. Surprise, surprise, the science is pretty straightforward. We're now passing the 1.5 degrees. And it's not just that we're increasing that concentration. It's the underlying reasons as to why climate change continues on its remorseless and deadly path that really count. It's a question of what is causing those increases in emissions, which are feeding through into that increased concentration. Item number one is, of course, the fossil fuels. So we've had all this talk about the great transition from fossil fuels to renewables. Really? What's actually happened? Well, the demand for oil has continued to rise for the last 35 years since the base years of 1990. And it's still going up. And although there are some people who think we've reached peak oil and it's about to decline, there are perfectly sensible projections backed now by significant investments which suggest that we'll still be burning 100 million barrels of oil in 2050 as we are now. On current trends, my guess is we're actually burning some more. Then there's coal. We are supposed to get out of coal. There are countries like the UK which pronounce their great virtue in having got out of coal. It's absolutely rubbish. What we've done is we've got out of coal for generating electricity, but of course we haven't got out of coal for producing the carbon-intensive and energy-intensive goods which we used to produce with coal in the UK, but now we import from the likes of China. How exactly have we got out of coal when we're going to be importing steel from China, importing solar panels from China, importing turbine materials for wind from China, importing a whole host of other high-density, high-carbon-based technologies? Think about aluminium. Think about petrochemicals. We're going to close the Grangemouth petrochemical plant. And what are we going to do instead? Turn it into an import terminal. Look absolutely great in our net zero numbers because, of course, we don't measure carbon consumption. We measure carbon production. And so on and so forth. Fertilizers, other chemicals. Think across to what's happening on even the cement front. And of course, we're going to build all those houses and all this new infrastructure. And when you really look at what's going into it, it's going to be massively carbon dense. And that's not surprising. That's true everywhere around the world. What's surprising in the UK is that we kind of pretend that we're really going down the path which COP has set out, and we are going to be at net zero 81% by 2035 and net zero for the power sector by 2030. Well, you can believe that if you want to, but there are some alternative scenarios which have quite a lot of credibility. So if you look at what we've done in the 35 years of all these COPs and ask yourself, how has it contributed to addressing the great scourge of climate change? Well, the COP framework, the targets, were supposed to be taken by developed countries, with developing countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia and so on, not having binding targets, but rather having aspirations to eventually have targets. And in the end, because Trump dropped out once and is about to drop out again, and because of the policies that particularly Obama and Biden have pursued in promoting the development of fossil fuels in the US to make the US the largest producer of oil, for example, in the world, because of those changes, effectively, the COP process has been a European process. Now it's the UK plus the EU, but the EU was the driving force. And why was it so easy for the EU to take on these targets? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. The EU came out of 1990 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and what must be described as a historical process of getting out of energy-intensive industries. Some more than others, and the process is not finished, but with the collapse of the German car industry, quite a lot more of it is happening. So, of course, from a net zero territorial carbon production perspective, Europe was going to look good. And indeed, we even went as far as to effectively bribe the Russians to join the Kyoto framework to make it operational by supporting their application to join the WTO in exchange for them signing up to Kyoto and crossing the crucial thresholds which were set out in the outset. Now, of course, this isn't because people have been mendacious. It isn't because there hasn't been an enormous political will to address climate change. Of course, as long as it doesn't actually increase costs and the price of energy, and particularly the affordability to customers. But when we go back over the process of these 29 COPs, the really significant bit, which was endorsed at the great Durban COP, was that the UN was going to put in place, or try to put in place, a legally binding treaty. And this was to set legally binding targets. And when you think about this, the chances of any major sovereign state in the world handing over the legal rights to the UN to prosecute it in the event that it didn't meet the, quote, legally binding targets was always a very, very far-fetched aspiration. It's a bit like when people in the League of Nations in the period before the Second World War thought that if we pursued peace and continued to do so, there would therefore be no war. It never turned out like that. The League of Nations never managed to head off the Second World War, and the UN has not managed to head off climate change. Now, that legally binding requirement was tried at Durban. Chris Huhne came back telling us what an incredible triumph it was in the House of Commons. Like all major leaders, we were saving the planet then, and they still seem to think, some of them, that they're saving the planet now. But when we got to the reality of Paris, which was supposed to take forward that desire from Durban, the Paris COP, the one that everyone thinks is such a triumph, we failed to have a legally binding treaty. Of course, there is an extent to which it's legally required that you update your NDCs, but that's not a legally enforceable target. So it failed. Not the great success that everyone claims. Paris was the point where we recognised this bit of the core architecture that the UN was pursuing was never going to happen. What Paris did was something in my mind which is even more disingenuous, which is to say, you know what, there's no way that the current voluntary commitments that the countries that are party to this process have given, there's no way that it's going to add up to 2 degrees. It's going to be more than 2 degrees. So I'll tell you what, let's set the target as 1.5 instead. Did anyone really think that we were going to stop at 1.5 degrees warming and that was going to be it? Did anyone think that the world would go on this path if Western companies were forced to be Paris compliant? It's a nonsense. It was never going to happen. And here we are. It's not that much further down the track. You know, it's not even a decade since then. And here we are going through the 1.5 degrees. Doesn't add up, doesn't work, and it's not going to save the planet. What we have to do is ask ourselves, is this COP process actually now a hindrance? Does it give people the excuse to believe that they can opt out of actually addressing these problems? It has effectively disintegrated in Baku into a give us the money, and if you don't give us the money, we won't play ball. And when it comes to give us the money, for which there's a reasonable argument, of course, the amount of money that people are talking about is, trivial compared with the scale of the problem and the transition that would be required if we were ever to actually have a transition from fossil fuels to renewables. The annual dividend of Saudi Aramco is over 100 billion per annum. 300 billion in 10 years' time, allowing for inflation, is not a very big number. And although there will be some contributions from the likes of China this time round, they're paltry compared with the contribution to pollution. Recall, China is the greatest emitter. And there's very little in here to talk about actually dealing with the other side of the climate change problem, which is sequestration. So we'll have another row about the money. We'll have a row about whether we can use the words that we're going to have a transition from fossil fuels, whatever that means. But the reality is that the next COP at Brazil will confront exactly the same problems. And of course, it's added to that Brazil is fast-tracking its ambition to be, amongst the top 10 oil producers in the world. So we're not moving from an oil producer to one that's resolved to get out of fossil fuels. Quite the contrary, we're moving to Brazil, which is designed to get into fossil fuels going forward. I don't think this is going to work. And the question comes, is there a better way? And my own view on this is yes, and it's the construction bottom up, not top down through the UN, of the coalition of the willing. And that means focusing on those countries who no longer want to contribute to climate change on carbon consumption, not simply carbon production. Very uncomfortable for a country like the UK, where carbon consumption may be 70% higher than carbon production. All that steel imported from China would have to be paid for. And taking carbon pricing domestically, applying it to the border, creates a massive incentive for other countries to join the coalition, because I'm sure they'd rather pay the carbon price in the goods that they are exporting to the UK to their own domestic government, rather than, for example, to the UK Treasury. So there is a better way forward. It is bottom up. It is the coalition of the willing. Things like the CBAM are absolutely essential to it. And what's more, it has a lot more chance of success. And I spelled some of that out in my book, Net Zero, but I'll be spelling that out over the coming months in subsequent podcasts. Thank you.